Welcome to another edition of Yorkton Stories, where we take a look at Yorkton's past and present in conversations with people involved in or familiar with the topic we're exploring. There are many interesting stories in the collective minds of Yorkton people, and this podcast loves nothing more than to tap into those. My name is Dick DeRike. This podcast is largely a labor of love, but we are grateful for the support of Harvest Meats and Grain Millers Canada, both here in Yorkton, and others who help out or listen to our stories. You can hear our podcasts on our website, yorktonstories.ca, where you will also find photos, links, and other information associated with each podcast when available. In many cases, you can not only hear the stories, you can also see and read information about the podcast topics. We can also be found in all major podcast directories, including Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, TuneIn and Alexa, and iHeartRadio. Search for Yorkton Stories, and you will find us. The history of newspapers in Yorkton now spans 132 years, starting with The Messenger, published in 1892, 2 years before Yorkton officially became a village. It was written by hand and reproduced by stencil on notepaper. But we have to wonder, in 2024, if the writing is on the wall for newspapers, as we explore the long history of this first, and for many years the only, means of mass communication locally. For me, this story is up close and personal. Having been one of the founders and the editor of Yorkton This, an upstart weekly newspaper in 1975, taking on the behemoth of newspaper companies at the time, Thomson Newspapers, which owned the likes of the Globe and Mail and the Times of London. At its height, it owned 148 newspapers, including many dozens in small-town Canada, 138 magazines, and had interests in radio and television in Canada, the US, and Britain. This podcast also provided the opportunity to reconnect with Bill Johnston, the editor of the enterprise for 2 years when we had just started Yorkton This, and then the publisher there for 2 years before he moved a short distance south to start the Fort Town Journal, serving Saltcoats, Bredenbury, Churchbridge, and Langenburg. He operated that newspaper for almost 40 years. We talked with Jack Dawes. Jack and I were the news department for more than a year, and we started in 1975. With Ken Chiz, who was in the newspaper business in Yorkton the last decade of the 1900s and the first decade after the turn of the century. We talked with Murray Mandrick, the longtime political and legislative reporter for the Leader Post, and Calvin Daniels, who has been a reporter and editor in Yorkton, as well as a prolific author for almost 35 years. In 2004, I was asked to write the history of Yorkton newspapers for Windows on Our History, published by the city in 2005 on the 100th anniversary of Saskatchewan becoming a province. Some of the historical information which follows is taken from that article. The book is still available at City Hall or the Tourism Yorkton office, as well as online. The Messenger, that first newspaper, published 12 weekly issues in the summer of 1882. It was the work of Reverend Byers of the Presbyterian Church to assist him in missionary work among the settlers. It was hand-produced as a stencil and then reproduced, likely on a new tabletop machine that was invented 20 years before that, called a mimeograph or stencil duplicator. Reverend Byers wrote, "If anyone wishes to pay for it, 25 cents will be the price. Everyone to whom this paper is sent may pay or not, as he pleases." In 1896, the Yorkton Enterprise was founded. James E. Peaker was the editor for the first 4 or 5 years. He would later serve as mayor of Yorkton in the late 1910s. Newspapers in the early years were the sole means for the expression of political and other points of view. They were a means by which the community could make their views known, and the local editors and owners were seldom at a loss for words and opinions. The enterprise was reputed to be the voice of the Conservative Party, and that led the Liberals to starting the Times in 1908. It lasted for 7 years and was succeeded by the Press, which disappeared in 1924. The enterprise went through several owners in its first 8 years until it was sold to the Enterprise Publishing Company, a public company founded by Dr. T.A. Patrick, a prominent conservative who had been elected to the Legislative Assembly of the Northwest Territories in 1897 and re-elected in 1902. In the meantime, a young printer's assistant from Toronto had heeded the lure of the West, and in 1904, Sam Wynne was hired as a typesetter by Edward Mackay, just before the newspaper was sold to the public company. In March of 1905, Sam Wynne was appointed the editor, starting his decades-long association with the enterprise. While the early newspapers contained advertising by local merchants, it was subscription revenue and support from political parties that provided the bulk of their income. News, when the community was smaller and life was simpler, was very detailed and personal. Community events and meetings, including town hall meetings, meetings of town and city councils, and school boards, were covered in detail, as were the comings and goings of local social circles, weddings, receptions, anniversaries, birthday parties of prominent residents, travel out of town for visits or meetings or medical appointments, reports on club meetings and speeches given throughout the town, all found a place on the tightly packed news pages. Local editors expressed their opinions freely. In the 1940s and 50s, the likes of Ken Mayhew, Sam Wynne, and Wilf McBurney held sway over public opinion. Newspapers often were leaders in the debates over local issues, including the very heated arguments over fluoridation of the Yorkton water supply in the 1960s that was still raging when I arrived here in 1967. At that time, it pitted the public health doctor for the city, an Irish gentleman whose name I don't recall, against the anti-fluoride forces, with one Lawrence Ball writing long letters to the editor on an almost weekly basis. During wars and during election campaigns, the newspaper office often became the focal point in the community. Crowds gathered outside on the street, awaiting the latest news. National and provincial politicians would not visit Yorkton without making a point to drop in at the newspaper office. I met Robert Stanfield during his ill-fated 1968 federal election campaign. Pierre Trudeau ignored us. But his provincial Liberal counterpart, Ross Thatcher, was a dominant presence whenever he was in town. By the 1970s, consolidation and concentration of business ownership had become a fact of life, and the newspaper industry was no exception. Thomson Newspapers bought the enterprise in 1963. Sam Wynne, the publisher since 1949, stayed on in that role until 1973, the last 2 years joined by Bob Thom as co-publisher. Sam had also been the editor from 1905 to 1952, succeeded by Ken Mayhew until his unexpected death after surgery in May of 1960 at the age of 54. Mayhew had been a reporter at the newspaper since 1928, had moved up the ranks to news editor, assistant manager, and associate editor. In 1953, he became vice president of the publishing company and its largest shareholder. With consolidation came the decline of local ownership and the arrival of outside managers who were mostly concerned with operating the business for the benefit of the absentee owners. That meant more emphasis on advertising revenue and less on news, which had little, if any, revenue potential. On his death in 1976, the New York Times reported that Roy Thomson, Lord Thomson of Fleet and the owner of Thomson Newspapers, had been quoted as saying, "I am in business to make money, and I buy more newspapers to make more money to buy more newspapers." In newspaper circles at the time, myth or fact, it was said that he had referred to news as the stuff that fills the spaces between the advertisements. Amid all of this, in 1975, Yorkton underwent an explosion of newspaper activity that bucked the trend and lasted for almost 30 years, although that too ended in consolidation of ownership. In 1975, Yorkton This Week was founded by Bob Tom, Ed Betker, and I. We were all employees of the enterprise. Bob was publisher, Ed was the production manager, and I was the news editor. Bob and I played morning golf several days a week, and as we were standing behind what was then the second hole at Deer Park, waiting out a light spring shower, Bob said, "We're making pretty good money for Thomson. What do you think about starting our own newspaper and doing that for ourselves?" If I hesitated at all, it was for no more than a few seconds. I was in. We had moved to Edmonton in 1969, where I worked for the Alberta government and Edmonton Transit for 5 years. But in that time, audacious as it may sound for a young family man in his mid-20s, I had seriously looked at an opportunity to buy a weekly newspaper in Sundre, Alberta. We had moved back to Yorkton in 1974 because my wife's family was all here, and it felt like home for us and our young kids. To have an opportunity to get in on the ground floor of a newspaper in our hometown was not to be missed. For the first 3 years, we rented space in the basement of a building on 2nd Avenue, and the newspaper was printed in Saskatoon. 49 years later, Jack Dawes remembers our first edition and that first year. So, Jack, you joined us when we first started the newspaper in 1975. And what is your, now 49 years later almost, what is your lasting memory of those very early days that you and I did the news together?
Well, there's a lot of great memories, Dick. So the first of all was it was obviously a shoestring operation that you and your wife Faye and two other couples had put together. I knew nothing about putting a newspaper together, knew a bit about writing. You didn't have a printing press, and so the negatives for the pages had to go to Saskatoon for printing. And we missed the last bus for Saskatoon. There were buses then, Dick.
Yeah, I remember those days.
Yeah. So my wife Jeanette and I had a fairly new half-ton truck with a cap on it. So we drove the page negatives to Saskatoon to a printing company. Then her aunt gave us supper. We slept a few hours and came back around 2 or 3 in the morning to pick up the newspapers.
And driving back to Yorkton?
Yes, driving back to Yorkton and slide them down a slide into the building. We were in the Shepherd Adamson building, and they were slid down a ramp of some kind.
And shoot,
yeah. And then the color comics were inserted in the newspaper.
But before that, you and I had to put the news together.
Yes.
And we did that for a year or more together, just the two of us in the basement of the Shepherd Adamson building. And my memory of that is that Mondays turned out to be really, really, really long days, usually stretching into Tuesday.
Exactly.
I do remember 2 things. I think you had a sleeping bag.
Eventually I did.
Brought a sleeping bag to work.
Yes.
And our wives would take turns delivering pizza or food of some sort.
Mostly your wife, because of course we lived in Saltcoats.
Yeah, and we were just up the street. But the whole shop was working late. I mean, this
right.
was the shop wasn't very big. I mean, but the advertising sales, which was Bob at the time, you and I in news, Ed Betker and a couple of 2 or 3 ladies in production and one guy.
Karen Wood was one of them.
Karen Wood, Wayne Romando. My memories were that we would get, if I remember right, to the point where every silly joke was extremely funny.
At 2 a.m, yes.
and you and I both had propensity for really bad puns, if I remember right. And Bob would get in on that as well.
I would say you were worse than I was.
On the other hand, I was a better speller than you were.
Yes, true. I grew up on phonetics. You're too young to remember that.
Yeah. There's a story that you and I still occasionally talk about, and I tell other people about. At that time, we were writing stories on a typewriter.
Yes.
On 8.5 by 5-inch sheets of
newsprint.
Copy paper, we called it. And you would type out your story, multiple pages, and hand it back to me, and I would go through and edit it. And I'm sure you remember the word that sticks in my mind.
Yes, I do.
Which was?
Golfer, Golpher. Everyone knows that.
Golpher. I looked at that, and I looked, what's he talking about? And then I realized what it was, and I burst out laughing. I think we had a really good...
Yeah, we had a lot of good laughs.
Yeah. I think that was kind of self-defense. As you said, we missed the first deadline, and we were under deadlines every week.
Yep, that's newspaper work.
As the newspaper work. Jack is still in the media as the ag reporter for the Rock FM radio. Back then, he was also part of MG Steelbridge Band, a very popular 4-man group, 2 of whom are still playing together, Jack and Ken Goodman. Here we are, like I said, 49 years later, and you're still doing news.
Yeah, I think I'm fortunate. I often put it in these terms. My first profession as a school teacher, I was in the system for about 10 years, taught for about 7 or 8 years. When I left the teaching profession, I had no idea that my next stop was going to be in media, and that as happened to be in Prince Albert, in radio. I'd never ever really even thought about doing newspaper. Of the several professions I've had, it's journalism, radio, or newspaper, I think that I've enjoyed the most. The immediacy of radio, I think, is what really hooked me, if that's the term.
You get the story and it's out there right
You
away.
get it out there, yeah.
Yeah.
Television, in the time I was doing television news, was especially the local station here wasn't really well equipped for television news. We used black and white movie type cameras, 16 millimeters. Although I will say, one of my forays with the 16 millimeter Bolex camera was just after a sudden summer rainstorm. Yorkton was flooded and there were people paddling canoes around. Eventually, the film got picked up by CBC and ran on the national news. Now, the downside of that was I had pictures of the big sign in front of the then Holiday Inn right across from CKOS television, bent over at about a 45-degree angle from this wind. And on the marquee, it said, appearing now at MG Steelbridge Band, but I didn't get footage of that. I got a picture of the sign in general. My musician buddies were really ticked off that our band name didn't show up on national television.
Because you were playing what?
Bass, guitar, and sax.
With the MG Steelbridge Band. With Gabora. That was that was one of the big bands in Yorkton.
Up and comers, yeah.
We then built office and production facilities on 2nd Avenue in downtown. Having been printed in Saskatoon initially, by 1980, we owned and operated a press plant at the corner of Dominion Avenue and Darlington Street, where we printed our own paper and several from nearby communities. It was, to say the least, a hectic and heady time for those of us in the newspaper business, those years in the mid-1970s. I've often said that I wouldn't have missed it for the world, but I would not have done it a second time. There was intense competition for the local advertising dollar. I still feel we had an early edge in news coverage, concentrating on stories about local people, while the standard fare of city council, courthouse, and police reports continued to be the staple of the enterprise. We concentrated on news about the local community. The enterprise, one could say, concentrated on local institutions. Things changed a year later when a new editor came into town to take over the news department at the enterprise, Bill Johnston.
I was working for a small publishing organization in Eastern Ontario, Northumberland Publishing. I was approached by a fellow by the name of Peter Brower. And he was probably one of the smartest newspapermen I've ever encountered. He had started a newspaper in Oshawa This Week, started from scratch. I wasn't looking for a job, but he approached me and said he had been approached by Thomson Newspapers after he had sold the Oshawa This Week for a fairly good dollar. They had approached him to put together sort of a rescue team to go into Thomson Newspapers that were suffering either editorially, advertising-wise, basically business-wise, to regenerate them, get them going again. And there was going to be a 3-person team. Peter would be in charge of the whole process, but I'd be in charge of the news side of it. And there would be one fellow who was a very astute advertising person. He'd be in charge of the advertising side of it. And we'd go into papers that were in trouble and get them going again. And our first newspaper we were told to go to, and asked to go to, was Georgetown Herald. Georgetown at that point was a small country community that was rapidly becoming a Toronto bedroom community. And it was really undergoing a real renovation in itself. But it was also the Georgetown Herald had a very good competitor, a very, very nice tabloid newspaper. Started out by some local folks, very smartly named it the Georgetown Independent, which is totally slapped in the face of the Georgetown Herald, which is a major conglomerate, and everybody knows that. Particularly when Thomson has a reputation for...
They were a little tight.
Well, okay, you could say that. Yeah. And also
parsimonious.
Yeah, parsimonious. I love that word, parsimonious. And also they were not known for turning out really great newspapers. Very gray, very blah type of things. After a while, people are beginning to have better expectations from their local newspaper. We went in there, the 3 of us. Within a year, I'm very proud to boast the fact that within a year, the Georgetown Herald was judged the top newspaper in its circulation category in all of Ontario. Based on that, sort of wave our flag a little bit. Advertising started coming back. Our readers started coming back. Another publisher came in. Typical Newt Thomson advertising manager, now in publishing position. Very little interest in community and the paper itself, just basically watching the bottom line. I spent another year there, but by the time I was finished that year, I was totally burnt out, just absolutely tired. So I quit the Thomson newspaper chain. Spent 3 or 4 months just sort of recuperating. And after about 4 months, when I was beginning to sort of think, well, I'd better get some money to start paying the bills here, I got a phone call from Thomson headquarters in Toronto saying, would you come in and talk to us? We'd like to talk to you about something. I said, sure, nothing to lose. So I went in and went to the Thomson Tower, a very large building in downtown Toronto, almost to the top floor, and met with 2 of the top senior executives of Thomson Newspapers in Canada. And they said, well, can Thomson treat you to lunch? And I was thinking, oh, yeah, there's some very impressive restaurants around downtown Toronto. We went down, took the elevator down to ground floor. We walked outside the building. There's a hot dog stand. And they bought me 2 hot dogs and a Coke. And then we sat down and found a spot to sit. We could watch people walk by. Fine, dandy, whatever. So we went back to the office. They had a stack of, I think, about 9 or 10 newspapers. They're all Canadian newspapers, all Thomson newspapers, from daily to weeklies. And they all had an executive position open. And they said, would you be interested in any of them? And this was from south part of BC to eastern New Brunswick. Each one of them I would open up and I'd kind of browse through it, and they'd give me a little bit of the history of that newspaper, current status, what the position was that was open. And each one of them was very typical Thomson newspaper, kind of gray, kind of blah, lots of opportunities, each one of them, but none of them really twigged at all whatsoever. Bottom one was the Yorkton Enterprise. I looked at it and I went through it, and they told me about the fact that 3 of our former employees are now starting up this very good newspaper against it. It's a very competitive market, good market. I was looking at it. Oh, sure, it was definitely a Thomson newspaper, and could see a real potential because it was sort of very consistent with the situation I faced in Georgetown, which was old established newspaper, country market type of thing, up against a really good competitor. And I knew I'd been able to do something there, so I kind of knew that I had experience to deal with that kind of situation. So I think I really shocked that pants off them when I said, I'll take Yorkton Enterprise. A few weeks later, I was in my little TR6 heading west to Yorkton, Saskatchewan. I had barely pulled into the Imperial 400 parking lot and got my room in there when the fellow I was replacing was phoning the room. Can I get together with you? I want to tell you all about it, because he wanted to
get out?
He wanted to get back to BC, like you wouldn't believe. To be very honest, it was love at first sight. I really fell in love with Yorkton that first afternoon and that first evening. We went out and he gave me a tour of the town, told me all about the papers, and people that I met that night were still friends.
Bill had an up-close view of the competitive situation between the two newspapers.
Typically, they like to feel as though they are the dominant force. I got an entirely different picture very quickly that they were not. I mean, they had lost their edge. You guys were actually coming along. Yorkton This Week was doing a really good job. It was a very good newspaper. So we were in a very tough competitive situation, and we were probably in the tail end of that. We really had to pick up our socks and start doing a good job. And it didn't help. Our publisher, Gary Gordon, talking to business people in the town that Thomson was going to put you guys out of business.
I heard that Gary Gordon and a fellow that came in from Toronto by the name of Kerry Lamb took me to the Mediterranean Cafe. Well, no, it was Bobby's Pancake House at the time. And sat me down and told me that I should not even think about going to work for Yorkton This Week because they were going to bury us. They did not know that I was involved in the ownership.
No.
Right? They thought that Bob was poaching, staff, and that he would approach me to come and work there. They pulled no punches. I just felt that was Toronto, coming to stomp on the prairies. And I think a lot of people in the community, business people especially, who are the ones that support the newspapers. I mean, as you know, subscriptions doesn't pay for a whole lot of expenses.
Absolutely.
The advertising. Right?
Absolutely.
They use that same approach with advertisers from what we were hearing.
I knew when I heard that story, and I heard it probably the second day I was in town, in the city, that this is a heavy hand that's trying to dominate the whole situation. I said, no, you got to develop a connection between the newspaper and the community if you're going to succeed. And this was not doing that at all. It was basically driving a wedge between the newspaper and the community, because, as you said, business people don't like to hear that kind of talk. So, it was just a given that if they were going to make a choice, it was going in your favor, in Yorkton This Week's favor.
They couldn't have done us a bigger favor.
Oh, absolutely.
Than what they were doing.
Oh, yeah. Right? I mean, that was a knock against.
Yeah.
And I knew that from the start. Yeah. We got to get rid of this problem.
I mean, I remember Brent Logan, who had the Chevrolet dealership, and who was president of the Chamber of Commerce when we started the newspaper and was a major advertiser with us. People like that just saying, you can't talk to the business community about local people like that.
Absolutely not.
I'm not sure whether the Thomson people ever understood that.
They were in their declining years. They were up against a lot of tough markets, and they were still feeling as though they were invincible. They were in trouble. And particularly with that attitude. And it didn't help that it was the West against the East. Yeah. I mean, Saskatchewan against Toronto. 1976, when I arrived, Parkland Mall was just about to open.
Yeah.
And that was a big boom for the city and for both of us. I mean, Thomson had a little bit of an advantage because there was a lot of national chains were going into that mall, and they were already recognized who the salespeople were in Toronto. Yeah. I mean, they already knew that sort of thing. So that we had a bit of a leg up on that, but it was a big thing for us at that point, for both of our papers.
Yeah, the national stores, the national chains initially all went to the Enterprise, with one exception, Canadian Tire.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. Bob had a very good relationship with the Canadian Tire, the local
manager.
Yeah, local manager, local owner, Gary Wojnarowski. They were with us almost from day one.
Yeah.
But the Zellers and it's hard to break into that because you basically have to go to Toronto and sit on their doorstep.
Yeah.
The Enterprise had people.
They were already there.
They were there,
Yeah.
and they were doing that,
Yeah.
right?
Oh, you're coming
And they
to
were
Yorkton.
selling advertising and giving them rates that covered the chain, preferred rates, because we're only selling for one newspaper.
Yeah.
You guys were selling for 70, 80, 100 newspapers.
Yeah, who knows?
However
Yeah.
many there were.
No, we did have a leg up on that.
One thing a newcomer like Yorkton This Week could not change: the Enterprise had been around for decades. The name was well known, and it had history, its own, in the city and regions.
The Enterprise was well liked in Yorkton. It was the paper. It was a paper of record for that entire area.
Yeah.
So, there's a real loyalty to the paper itself. But there is a changing dichotomy there, which is that businesses are going to pay the bills. And you got to be on the right side of that.
We had people refer to us as, they'd say, oh, the Enterprise. And I'd say, no. I'd say, oh, yeah, no, you're the new Enterprise.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
it just shows you how
Yeah.
much of a relationship there was between the community and the Enterprise.
But you're right. I mean, it was a paper record from the very early 1900s until, through the Ken Mayhew, Rolf McBurney years.
Sam Wayne.
I remember going through old Yorkton Enterprise newspapers, the stories there that Ken Mayhew especially wrote. It was about the guest speaker at the Rotary Club, and it took a whole page, because everything that happened in the community
was in the Enterprise. Enterprise, absolutely.
Yeah.
And not just that community, but the entire area. I mean, it really was an important media, and probably the media, pretty well 3/4 of that century.
Yeah.
The competition for news became more intense with the arrival of Bill Johnston. After all, he had been hired by Thomson Newspapers to change things in Yorkton, as he had done in Georgetown a few years earlier.
We were competitive. I mean,
Highly competitive.
We picked up your paper as soon as it was off the press, and we'd go over it. Oh, darn it all, we missed that, or we didn't cover it as well as they did. And I'm sure there were times when we did something that you guys said, we missed that too.
We did the same thing.
Yeah.
We'd pick up the paper and go through it to see what they did that we should have done or could have done.
Yeah.
Pat ourselves a little bit on the back if you didn't have what we had.
Mm-hmm.
Our reporters, and at that time, I know now at Yorkton This Week, I think there's 2 reporters. We had 4.
I had 2.
Plus yourself.
Yes.
Yeah. I had 3 plus myself.
Yeah. Well, you had Jack Dawes.
The first 2 years there was only 2 of us, Jack Dawes and I.
Yeah.
For the first year and some. We still produced a lot, but it took a lot out of us to do that.
Yeah.
But then as we grew and moved into our own building, we expanded the news staff. My partners believed, like I did, that you need to put out the good news product first, because that's what attracts people to the newspaper. And if you get enough people reading it and talking about it, that then gets through to businesses.
Well, you were creating an identity for the newspaper.
Yeah.
I mean, that was our asset. Was we had an established identity. Maybe it was as the old newspaper, but it's still, people recognize the Enterprise.
Yeah.
It's there. So we really didn't have to sell ourselves at all.
We reminisced about our first days in the newspaper business in Yorkton, May of 1967 for me, Bill in August of 1976.
My first day on the job at the Yorkton Enterprise, Monday morning. One of the first people to come through the door, Ruth Shaw. She had to kind of inspect the new editor, and she gave me a bit of a grill. And also a real good history about her and Cliff and how they kept the leader post. Great friend forever, ever from that point on. Then in the afternoon, this big, very dominant figure appeared in the doorway of our editorial office. And it was Dr. Houston, Sr. CJ. I think he too wanted to check out who the new editor is, because he loved the Enterprise. No question about it. That was part of the history of Yorkton, and that was so important to him. And I think he wanted to see who's the new fellow behind the desk there. And he kind of gave me a pretty good grilling, and he gave me I knew that I better toe the line here, otherwise I'm going to be hearing from him. Never did hear from him again.
When I came to Yorkton in 1967, working at the Enterprise, Ruth Shaw was still with the Leader Post doing news and circulation. And I got to know her very well immediately. She took me under her wing.
Oh, she did, everybody.
And introduced me. And it was funny because we would go to events. Her son, Doug, who is exactly my age, and we were both at that time, reasonably good-looking young men. Doug had gone off to university, and suddenly Ruth shows up at these things with a guy that looks like Doug. And everybody assumed that I was Doug. And said, you must be. No, I'm not. And Ruth would explain that, no, Doug is off to university. This is Dick, and he's the new reporter at the Enterprise. And we remained friends till the day she died. Yeah. Even before she worked for the Chamber of Commerce, she was probably the prime Yorkton booster of all time.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And we talked about the larger local media market at that time, because Yorkton, as the commercial and retail hub of East Central Saskatchewan and Western Manitoba, had been the dominant regional newspaper and media center. That role became more prominent after the larger provincial daily newspapers abandoned coverage of news outside their home cities. In the early 1900s, the Winnipeg Free Press and the Tribune covered news in the region and shipped newspapers into town. Later, the Leader, and then the Leader Post in Regina, gave prominent coverage to what was happening in southern Saskatchewan, with page 3, the provincial page, devoted to news from outside the capital city. The Leader Post maintained many rural bureaus, and through the 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s, Cliff Shaw and later Ruth Shaw provided extensive coverage of Yorkton news.
And then we came along, and then others came along, because Yorkton was a media hotspot. I mean, not just the Enterprise, Yorkton This Week, the community news or the news review. Radio was huge.
GX was great.
Carl Worth doing the news, Morley Jager doing the news, Ed Lawrence on the morning show.
Ed Lawrence, right.
I mean, and CKOS, the twin stick television, Linus Westberg, who can forget Linus?
Absolutely. Norm Roebuck was in there.
Norm Roebuck doing the farm news, Roger McLaughlin. When I came to Yorkton, there was one channel, and then that was CBC.
Yeah.
That was CKOS. And it was the Skinner brothers. And then they got the second, they got CTV.
Yeah.
And until cable came along in the 80s, that was it. That was, we had two channels.
Yeah.
The other interesting person who was there at the time was Chris Cuthbert. Worked at both radio and television in Yorkton before he went back down east. Mm-hmm. And he still does the NHL broadcasts.
Absolutely.
Well, and Kurt Kielbach
went on to become the voice of the Winnipeg Jets.
Yep, and the Arizona after that.
It was a really lively media market.
Yep.
And we all worked together.
Yep.
I mean, if you wanted to have an event in the Yorkton area, there were a few things that you had to do, 3 things that you had to do. First of all, you had to add ads in the papers. And then you had to have time on TV. Jerry Pepler's show. You had to be on Jerry Pepler's show for sure.
Yeah.
And then you had some ads on the GX.
Yeah.
And if you did all that, you're going to have a good, successful event.
Yeah. Remember Ed Lawrence and Clarence the Crow? His sidekick?
Absolutely. I forgot about those. Yes.
Yeah, you know what? There's things about 2 days ago that I can't remember. But and I can honestly say that for the most part, certainly on my part, it wasn't personal. For Bob Tom, it might have been more personal than for the rest of us, because the level that he was at with him, Thomson, and leaving. We all saw each other at all the events. Everybody covered everything. And to this day, I don't eat turkey, because when I was in Yorkton at the Enterprise from 1967 to 1969, Yorkton was the turkey capital of Canada.
That's true, yeah.
And every banquet we went to, and there was a lot of them, it was turkey.
Well,
I ate enough turkey in those 2 years to last me.
Well, for my years in Yorkton, I can't eat borscht. I can't eat borscht for that very same reason. Every time I went to an event, it would be Ukrainian meal and would always have borscht.
Borscht, yeah. When there was a banquet with a meal at the Legion Hall, that became something that everybody wanted to go to because the ladies there made roast beef.
The two Yorkton newspapers competed until 1990, when the Enterprise and Yorkton This Week were both purchased by Armadale Company Limited of Hamilton, Ontario, which also owned the Leader Post in Regina and the Star Phoenix in Saskatoon, as well as other newspapers in Saskatchewan. For both Armadale and Thomson, it was a trade-off. Armadale gained control of the Yorkton market and sold its branded newspapers to Thomson, giving it control over that market. With one deal, they did away with two competitive situations. The two Yorkton newspapers were amalgamated into Yorkton This Week and Enterprise. That led to opportunities for others. Yorkton and District Paper started publishing The Paper, a free distribution advertising paper, in 1991, and a year later they came out with The Newspaper, distributed free of charge to Yorkton residents. Both consolidation and startups continued throughout the 1990s. In 1995, Armadale Newspapers, including Yorkton This Week and Enterprise, was sold to Hollinger Limited of Toronto. In 1996, the Community Review was first published by Community Publishing, a consortium of local and regional weekly newspapers in eastern Saskatchewan. In 2001, the newspaper and the Community Review amalgamated into the News Review, and that same year, the Community Post, owned and operated by David and Donna Busis, began publication every second week. Also in 2001, Yorkton This Week and Enterprise was purchased by Peter Eng, owner of the Estevan Mercury, who shortened the name to just Yorkton This Week, marking the end of the Enterprise name on a Yorkton newspaper masthead for the first time in 105 years. Then in 2004, Yorkton This Week, the News Review, and the Community Post were purchased by Glacier Ventures International, a publicly traded company which also acquired other Saskatchewan community newspapers and farm newspapers at the time. The Community Post continued to appear every other week as part of the News Review, while the News Review and Yorkton This Week, both under the same ownership of Glacier, continued to publish their newspapers independently. Ken Chiz was involved throughout and remembers that long sequence of change.
You started in competition with the established newspapers back in 1991. What was the impetus for that? Yorkton was going through a lot of changes, and there were more than enough newspapers to start with, some would say.
Well, at the time, working in BC on Vancouver Island at the Sydney Review, both the Yorkton This Week and Enterprise decided that they were going to combine to one product. And the community of Yorkton was so used to having two products from a newspaper perspective that they were worried that the prices were going to get all jacked up and stuff. And apparently some of them did. And I got some phone calls and interest and stuff, said, Ken, why don't you come back here and start your own paper, because we need another product here to keep everything competitive. So I thought about it, and you know what? Vancouver Island really wasn't my thing, because, when I could see Vancouver lights and it takes me 2.5 hours to get there, when you're used to getting somewhere in half an hour, it's just a little hard to take.
You started out as an advertising-only publication, which in the day we used to call shoppers.
Right.
And they were all over the place, and they survived on advertising. A year later, you decided to get into the news side of it as well, and you had the newspaper, which was actually a full newspaper.
Well, it was to some extent. Our premise was we were only going to publish good news, and we had a person on staff who was selling that had a strong editorial background. His name was Dan Buckles. So he was doing the writing for us, and we figured, well, yeah, let's give the people a little bit more to look at. Yep.
Same Dan Buckles who used to be the publisher of the Enterprise?
Same one.
Then in 1996, while you were still in business, there was a few other changes over the next 5 years or so. Community Review, which was run by some of the people that had newspapers in the region, in the area.
I guess the best way to explain it is a bunch of the newspapers in the area decided to get together and start their own press plant. Bought a building in Melville, and they bought an old press, and they started printing newspapers there. Foam Lake was one of them, Melville, Carlisle, Kenora, possibly even 10 different newspapers. Grenfell, I believe, was there as well, and they'd all print there.
Yeah. Was that in part a reaction to the Yorkton newspapers with their shoppers going out into their territory, into their communities, and they wanted to get something out in Yorkton?
I don't know if it was that, or it was just the case that they thought they were paying a lot of money to get their paper printed long distance away. It was either Moose Jaw or Saskatoon or Regina, and they thought if they could have their own press, it'd save them some money.
That was a fairly competitive market at the time.
You got that right. One thing we tried not to do is price cut, because as soon as one cuts and the other cuts, and it just gets to the point where nobody's successful.
Yeah. Then 2004, more changes. Yorkton This Week, the News Review, the Community Post were all purchased by
Glacier Media,
which still owns Yorkton This Week today.
Yeah.
How was that viewed by the people inside the newspapers that were operating at the time?
Well, that's a tough call. Was it a good move on their part? To be honest with you, anybody that was buying newspapers at that time, you can see what newspapers are doing now. Even flyer distribution now, people are putting their flyer online, and there's very few flyers as well.
Yeah. The News Review and Yorkton This Week, both owned by the same company, kept publishing as separate publications for a while.
Oh, yes.
You're competing with yourself.
When we were in competition with each other, we were profitable, and I'm sure they were profitable. Yeah. So if it's not broke, don't fix it.
Yeah. Today, the news is still the news, but the way news is delivered by the traditional newspapers is changing. Kelvin Daniels has been a reporter and editor in Yorkton for nearly 35 years, a newspaper award winner and an author of books. He has observed it all from his desk in the newsroom. I asked him when these changes started to happen.
This wasn't one of those things where you kind of turn on a light switch. I mean, it's been very gradual, actually, because we started out, we had our own Yorkton This Week website for a long time, and then slowly became more and more focused on the online product. And then eventually all the Glacier papers were part of that chain, came under the one heading of sastoday.ca. And instead of having each individual paper having a site, it's been a very gradual thing that's probably taken place over 10 years.
What has that meant for you and the reporters at Yorkton This Week?
I suspect for somebody that went to journalism school, it reminds them much more of radio or television in that sense, right? I mean, go out, get the story, get it back, get it online. For a newspaper guy and one that didn't take journalism in the first place is certainly different. It used to be kind of batch writing. Early days in Yorkton with the Enterprise, Monday night you'd spend till midnight at the office writing. Now you're right. You go out, you do a story, and you tend to do them as quickly as you possibly can get them done.
What kind of a reaction are you getting from readers, subscribers, to that whole change? Is it being welcomed? Is it seen as inevitable?
Well, certainly it's inevitable. I don't think there's any turning back the clock on this one any more than going back to the days that there was a CompuGraphic wire service at the Enterprise that was half the size of a grand piano. You just don't go back. That said, I think there's a bit of a split out there. If you're younger, my son's closing in on 40, and his age and younger, they're so used to everything being on the web that I think it's quite natural for them to find their news via a website. If you're more like you and I, with lots of gray hair and more years of experience, I think there's still a desire to have that newspaper, at the coffee table or wherever it is that you read the newspaper. And so I think you have a bit of a dichotomy based on age. It's just that, we are kind of have our habits, right? Some people are going to find this a very natural progression. I'm just going to find my news online and they're going to be happy. Others, they still want that paper in their hands. And at this point in time in Yorkton, both are still available to you.
As Kelvin said, change has been gradual, but nobody is betting that those changes won't accelerate and drastically alter the newspaper business going forward. Closing thoughts on that from Calvin, Murray Mandrick, Ken Chiz, Bill Johnson, and I. Do you see this move to online at some point doing away with the printing press and the printed copy? And if so, how far down the line might that be?
Well, the simple answer is yes. The when is anybody's guess, and I'm certainly not in the loop of, Glacier in Vancouver. Brighter minds than mine will make that decision, obviously. But it depends, I think, where you're at as well in the world. If you're in Toronto, I suspect the move is going to maybe come quicker than you might expect because that's just the world of big cities. Yorkton, Saskatchewan, maybe not quite so quick. They'll make decisions like that kind of based on a market by market. And I suspect that Saskatchewan will be slower to move away from print than most just because of kind of the makeup of the province. But long term in the world of, electronics and computers, that could be, 5 years, might be 10. But someday I suspect that the printed page will be a thing of the past. I also believe that for books and that as well. Like, I don't think that long term there's going to be a lot of printed books. But I don't think you can stop the momentum long term. I've been at this for about 35 years in Yorkton now. And, the changes I've seen are astronomical, right? When I first got here, I was still doing half my stories on an Underwood typewriter. It has completely changed. There's no doubt about that. I do think it's inevitable that we'll be only online. And in that process, some papers won't exist. I'm not in that loop at all. But it's how well you can monetize online.
Gone. I don't think we'll see the word paper in newspapers anymore. I don't think we'll see anything vaguely resembling a traditional print edition. I know from our own subscribers at Leader Post and Star Phoenix, they're getting very, very old. And I'm not talking just our age old. We might be young compared with the relative print subscribers these days, and that's unfortunate. But that's just the reality everywhere. Nobody wants to be carrying around something where you get canola ink on your hands anymore. It's everybody gets their stuff online, and that's a hard thing for someone like me who spent my whole life waiting for that daily newspaper to come to our door, but it just doesn't come to door. And I think it's even harder for the weeklies, but I think there's a function for community news. It might be taking a very different form. The real problem right now is that a lot of news outlets, including weeklies, are finding it exceedingly difficult to compete with, from an advertising venue, with what's online. And that's, I think, a real serious battle for communities the size of Yorkton that are getting more and more, I think, dominated by either chain restaurants, chain stores, chain whatever, and where you're seeing less local business and less of a willingness to sort of advertise locally. And I think that that's hugely problematic for the survival of community newspapers. And to be quite frank, I think most of us now, they're still in print, are in the category of community newspapers. I doubt in a decade from now we'll see any left, because just even the distribution of a print product is massively difficult, and so massively difficult compared to the immediacy of electronic distribution of anything. I hate to say that people like me are going to go the way of the dinosaur, but they might be, because people go online to find someone that they generally agree with. People will not read or even tolerate the opinion on a daily basis of someone that they're going to disagree with. I think generally speaking, it drives newspapers in one of two directions. It drives them further towards one political area that they think is the majority, where they think they can get the most subscribers, etc., or it drives them towards pablum. Do we do real journalism, or do we do stuff that basically has a lot of clicks? And sometimes a lot of clicks are really light, fluffy stories that don't offend anybody or have no particular reason to offend anybody. But we know damn well that that's where our bread's buttered on, and there's a lot of pressure from up top to basically follow the clicks.
Perhaps the big ones like the Globe and Mail, that'll be surviving. I mean, I look at a lot of the days like Moose Jaw's closed down, and this isn't a slam against or a knock against Yorkton This Week, but, I still subscribe to that paper, and there seems to be, it's revenue that keeps them going, and it's advertising's the revenue, and there's very little advertising, and even a strong point was always their flyer distribution through Marketplace, and there's fewer flyers going there. 10 years from now, I don't know if you'll see too many newspapers around at all. Anybody can go watch TV or check the newspaper online. There'll still be newspapers, but they'll be online only.
I don't claim to be a foreseer of the future, but probably about 30 or 40 years ago, I said the printing press is going to be the dinosaur of the 21st century. Yes, there will be a few of them left, but it's so much easier to distribute news without paper.
Yeah.
So that really the hard copy newspaper is going to be very limited. My own grandkids, they don't read newspapers.
No.
They're on the phones and they're on the tablets and they're on the computers all the time, and have lectured me about the waste of paper that is going into newspapers. They're very environmentally concerned as well, which is a very valid concern. So it may be news, but it will not be newspapers. What do you think?
Newspapers in the smaller communities, and I'm talking about, the Churchbridges and Moosomin's, Whitewoods, will probably survive longer than the ones in the cities, because radio and television don't get out here.
Oh, for sure.
Right?
Yes.
So it's still, to a large degree, it's the only source of news in a place like Churchbridge, whereas in Yorkton, it's more dictated by the immediacy that is provided by radio, television, and now Yorkton This Week is online, and when they cover something, the story is there right away. So why do I need to get it in on paper 5 days later?
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
I mean, interestingly, the Moosomin World Spectator, it's always been an excellent newspaper. It has a larger page circulation than Yorkton This Week.
No surprise in that.
In a community of 4,000?
Yeah. Yep.
Versus 20,000, because they are still, to a large degree, the only game in town.
And they do it very well. The fate of the newspapers in small towns is in the hands of the papers themselves.
Yeah.
If you're going to work hard and produce a product that's readable and is immediate, find things that you're not going to find anywhere else, you got a good future, particularly if you got a good business community, where Moosomin definitely has.
Where are the businesses in Moosomin going to advertise, if not in their local paper? Yeah. Because if you buy advertising on CTV in Regina, you're paying to get coverage from a market area that is not your market area.
Absolutely.
Right? Because it's much broader.
Yeah.
I have some confidence that newspapers in small towns, the small town weeklies, will survive. They probably at some point need to augment it by being online as well. But Regina and Saskatoon daily newspapers are now printed in Estevan.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, Moosomin World Spectator is printed over in Alberta to run a press. That's a big business, and there are not too many that are doing that any longer.
No. It's not like the days when when you and I were checking each other out to see who had the better stories that week.
Yeah, or who had the more advertising. And you kept beating us. That was always frustrating for us.
We will publish another podcast in about 3 weeks. Visit yorktonstories.ca to hear this and all previous podcasts. And there you can also sign up for our email list so we can let you know when a new episode is available. Thanks again to Harvest Meats and Grey Millers Canada, both here in Yorkton, for their support. And thank you for listening. Your comments and suggestions are always welcome. Get in touch through our website or by emailing Dick, D-I-C-K, at yorktonstories.ca. And we'll talk again soon.